Hey guys, welcome back. This is the story about what if Naruto was a hollow. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel and like the video as well, it really means a lot. So let's start the what if. Kill. The roof of the Greater Soul King Palace was silent as Naruto held his release pose. No one dared say a word, even as the battlefield was still for a relatively long time. A dim orange glow appeared directly in the center of Naruto's sword. After some time, it became brighter and spread outward, until it had covered the entire length of Naruto's zanpakuto, bathing it in a dull, rusty orange color. The zanpakuto was vibrating, creating a low hum that eventually subsided into an agonizing screeching noise, like metal scrapping against metal in an endless cacophony. Zoro! The zanpakuto shattered into a million orange pieces, the steel floating in the air like particles before completely disintegrating. In the silence of the tension, Naruto chuckled lowly, before his head snapped back forcefully, and he roared. A great, powerful, animalistic roar that he hadn't done in quite some time. He cast a gaze at his siblings, and his pupils dilated. What was little more than a feral look crossed his face, his teeth bared at them. Then, his Ryatsu exploded, nearly knocking both siblings off their feet. He was shrouded in a maelstrom of orange Ryatsu that looked more solid than any Ryatsu that either sibling had ever seen. It moved with a viscous consistency, flowing and falling as if it were an orange ooze enveloping the Primera's body. He was still very much visible at the center, though as more of a dark silhouette. The energy covered his form, and began to harden into blood-red hollow armor. His curved half-eyepiece with ears mask framed both sides of his face, and material branched off from his fox ears to across his forehead while extending down and creating teeth over Naruto's upper lip. His eyes had remained uncovered by his mask, but they were still blood-red and far more slanted than usual. His pupils were still highly dilated, and the effect they had made it seem like he was staring off into space. His red whisker marks spread outward, curving to his temples and giving him a type of war paint. Spikes were jutting out of every joint where the red armor met, from his shoulders, to his kneecaps, to his elbows. 9 brutal tails sprouted from his backside, covered in red armor to their tips, where they were, strangely enough, covered in a white armor and shaped in a manner reminiscent of a pincer. His hollow hole was enormous. A giant gaping wound where his heart should have been, it sucked up space on his torso. But Akane's eyes were instead drawn to the strange symbol below the hollow hole, on Naruto's stomach. What looked like a set of stylized jaws were framing a large vortex of energy on Naruto's stomach, directly where his seal used to be. It was a dull white in color, but it crackled with life as it swirled like a galaxy within him. Naruto's roar began to subside as the whirling tornado of orange Ryatsu dissipated, and he floated toward the ground in his new form. He flexed a claw in front of his face, feeling out the long, pitch-black claws with his own eyes. Both Akane and Taiki looked uncomfortable in his presence. Good. Naruto thought. They both raised their weapons, once again with Akane taking up the front and Taiki falling back to attack from a distance. No reason for them to change battle strategies if that is what is most effective for them. But perhaps they may change their mind after a few rounds. Naruto thought. The walking wasteland that was Naruto still exuded Ryatsu to the point where it was like a cloak, even if the torrent had died down. He raised a claw, feeling the Ryatsu oozing off it while Akane raised her crystalline shuriken. He was on Akane before she could even comprehend it, his fist buried in her gut. His powerful Ryatsu seared straight through her robes to the sensitive skin of her stomach, and she reacted desperately by swinging her sword upwards, trying to cleave Naruto's head off. He twisted his body, and his other arm met her blade, grasping the tip of it in his armored claw. His arrow was apparently strong enough to stop even Shinkegafu, as there was only a slight cut where Naruto had grabbed it. Without missing a beat, Naruto's arm moved in a flash of movement, grabbing the hem of Akane's robe only a split second after releasing her sword, and hurled her away with such force that she nearly broke the sound barrier. As she flew through the air with such velocity, Naruto appeared directly above her with a burst of sonido, delivering a nasty kick to her stomach, watching her plummet to the roof directly below. Akane! Taiki called out, watching his sister get battered and beaten. It turned out to be a bad move, because Naruto set his stony gaze upon him, smiling a psychotic smile of serrated teeth, and charged him. There was a lunacy in his eyes that Taiki had not seen before. He was far less reserved than he was before, and even then, he wasn't particularly stoic. He had taken out Akane so fast, that when Taiki looked down at his shuriken, he knew that it wasn't going to do enough, regardless of the amount of kido that he threw at his brother. He turned his club upside down, smashing the metal head against the ground. Bankai! The youngest Namikaze stood his ground, his yellow Ryatsu exploding to a magnitude unparalleled compared to what it was before, and his club disappeared. Taiki had hoped the entrance of his Bankai would serve as an intimidation factor, but Naruto didn't even flinch when a pillar that looked very much like a larger version of Taiki's shuriken plummeted from the sky. 3 more of the black pillars followed, crashing to the ground in 4 corners directly around Taiki. Suzu no Hashira. However, before Taiki could even think about using his Bankai, Naruto's Sonido allowed him to appear directly in the middle of it all. Ha 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 ha. Naruto cackled, his red eyes bloodshot as his pupils dilated. I'm having so much fun, I can't stand it. I've gotten so caught up in my goals that I forgot to enjoy them. Isn't that just funny? He roared, jabbing a claw into Taiki's midsection. While he was stabbing him through, he kicked Taiki, dislodging him, yet knocking him directly back into one of his pillars. The black pillar collapsed and Taiki plummeted outwards, coming dangerously close to the soul stream. His power and speed are so much stronger, it's ridiculous. Even with Bankai, I'm not sure we can win. But we don't have time to just hold him off until help arrives, we need to find a way to stop the soul stream. He thought. Ah, come on. I couldn't have beaten you both with just my physical abilities, he trailed off, the manic smile on his face turning into an angry frown. Keep your asses up, both of you. You ain't dead yet, he growled, howling to the sky once again. Give me something else to look forward to. Tsunade, it really has been so long since I saw you. Things have been holding up well for you during the past century? Sarutobi Hiruzen asked casually, walking right past Neutra as if he weren't even there. You old geezer, what are you even doing here? Do you know the situation we're in? Tsunade roared at the old-looking Vazard. The former Sandaime continued smiling his serene smile and walked up to Tsunade and Ino, sitting on the ground in front of them. You mean how Naruto has become a hollow and has invaded clear up to the level of the Soul King? You could say that I'm aware of the situation, Tsunade. You never did give me enough credit. He said wistfully, shaking his head. So you do know what's been going on. How the hell did you get here, anyway? Well, the others didn't really feel like helping out the Soul Society, so they stayed on Earth. I, however, couldn't help but respond to a call about Soul Society's danger, and tried to get here as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the gateway to Soul Society isn't exactly easily accessible for someone like me, and I was still on Earth until that happened, Sarutobi explained, pointing to the reflection of Karakura Town in the sky. Tsunade had noticed the reflection in the sky for a while now, but she didn't really understand what it was for. She recognized the city. Karakura Town was always known as a hotbed of spiritual activity, but this was just absurd. It looks like it's a reflection, but it is in fact a portal. Something's going on with the space between the human world and Soul Society, and that includes this dimension by extension. I was able to come here through that opening. But I must say, I didn't expect to find myself in the Greater Soul King Palace. What has happened to Soul Society proper? It was where I was planning on going before I ended up here. It's in bad shape, Sarutobi-sensei. The Sotaicho and several captains have been killed by the invading Arrancar. When we left, it was on the verge of being destroyed, but all of the remaining Espada jumped ship to here, so perhaps the remaining captains can hold them off. I'm not so sure, though. Sarutobi sighed. But that's not important right now. You haven't been back here ever since that hollowification incident with Urahara over 100 years ago. You haven't even been in contact with us. Why have you decided to come here now? Tsunade asked. I'm the only one of my kind who was willing to come, and none of that is on behalf of the Soul Society itself. When I learned of Naruto's intentions, it became clear to me that I should help you personally. That's why I'm here, on behalf of the former village of Konoha. Tsunade snorted. Well, your help may be appreciated right now. I don't even know what that brat Naruto is doing right now. Minato and Kushina were supposed to stop him, but from the looks of things, he's been up to something for a while now. Should we trust Minato and Kushina? Sarutobi asked. We don't really have a choice. There's no way back up to the Greater Soul Palace. The only thing we can do from this point is help the remaining royal guard clear out the wave of hollows. Tsunade said, pointing to the army of hollows that surrounded them. And then, there's the matter of him. She pointed to Neutra. Surprisingly, the Sexta Espada just stood there while Tsunade and Sarutobi had their conversation. That power, what did you do? Neutra asked, speaking up for the first time. The old man's Ryatsu was very similar to theirs, and in addition, there was that mask. Sarutobi didn't respond to Neutra. This was not the time for conversation. Instead, he put a hand to his face, as white particles converged into one near the top of his head. He pulled the forming mask over his face like a curtain, his eyes turning a pitch black. The Ryatsu in the area became much thicker, and Neutra bristled slightly. That was the mask he had been wondering about, the one he had used when he killed those hollows, and had dispatched while talking to the woman. Son of a bitch! Neutra roared, as he brought a scythe up to block the precise strike from the old man. The old man thrust off with a surprising amount of limberness, kicking him in the stomach. It did nothing in the face of his arrow, but stunned him momentarily. He skidded backwards, jamming his blades into the ground in order to halt himself. While Sarutobi collected his bearings, Neutra just barely managed to notice a trio of vines coming. What the hell? Neutra thought. He thought he had dealt with that annoying plant, but he could clearly see that Tsunade was using her Ryatsu to reassemble her Bankai, and it was already almost done too. It was enough to shoot its vines at him, at least. With a quick grunt, he twirled his right scythe behind him, cutting the 3 vines like rope before he could slide into them and be whipped or captured. Unfortunately for him, it was now a TW-on-1 battle, and neither opponent was resting. Well, it was technically 3-on-1, but the other girl wasn't exactly even the slightest bit useful in this situation. And apparently, the disadvantage he had was coming to light, because while he was distracted by Tsunade, Sarutobi had used a quick Shuanpa to get up to him and lop his left arm clean off. Neutra's scythe went flying, still attached to the arm even as it stuck into the ground. Neutra growled, unperturbed by the loss of the arm, and used his other arm to slash at Sarutobi, his remaining scythe glowing with yellow Ryatsu. He missed, but used the momentum and superior strength to throw the old man backwards, pushing him around. He followed up with 3 more diagonal slashes from his scythe. It was a proper distraction, one that would allow his other arm to grow back. What Neutra was not expecting was for the old man to charge up a white zero in the horn on his mask, keeping it charged while he continued to sword dance with Neutra. Zero? Shit! Neutra cried, sticking out his tongue and charging a powered-up version of his golden zero. The 2 blasts met in midair, and the Sexta's was apparently strong enough to overwhelm Sarutobi's. For a moment, it seemed like Neutra had got him, but the Arrancar's hopes were dashed when the figure of the old man dashed from the blast radius, traveling parallel to the beam. Protect, Hokage! As Sarutobi rushed Neutra, his blade poised for an attack, he proclaimed his release command with an air of confidence, even with his garbled voice. His sword began to glow a bright red color, before it disappeared, and he was carrying nothing but a hilt. However, the hilt disappeared in time as well, expanding to become a large, green staff as long as Sarutobi was. It was made of a hard, thick metal, but Sarutobi wielded it with ease, without it seeming cumbersome to him at all. Interesting Shirkai. But what do you plan to do with that thing? Neutra howled, crossing both his sides and holding a steady defensive position as Sarutobi thrust out his staff. Sarutobi let loose a grunt as the staff impacted with Neutra's scythes, and the Arrancar was surprised when they shattered instantly from the apparent hardness of the staff. Regaining his momentum, Sarutobi moved to strike again, his speed augmented by his hollow transformation. However, Neutra took the time in between attacks to move out of range, creating more scythes from the holes in his wrists. He parried the second strike by pushing back before Sarutobi could hit him, but the old man twirled his staff, hitting Neutra on the top of the head, where he was without any way of dodging. The sexta found his face in the stone beneath him, and to make matters worse, for strong vines wrapped around his torso, arms, and legs, preventing him from moving. He turned around to see the gigantic Venus flytrap that was Tsunade's Bankai had now completely reconstructed itself, all 7 of its vines capable of attacking once again. Tsunade had taken her rightful place on top of the Bankai, just like before. A shadow fell over Neutra as he pulled the vines off him, slashing at the last one with his scythes. Sarutobi had taken the opportunity to leap into the air, twirling his bulky staff in preparation for a finishing blow. Neutra growled again, sticking his feet out and flipping up into a standing position, ready to take the attack. Sarutobi thrust the staff downwards early, baiting Neutra into swinging both of his scythes. However, Sarutobi impacted the ground with a dodging duck, avoiding the scythes and putting himself in prime position to attack once more. His staff gleamed with Ryatsu, and he pointed it at Neutra as if he were making a stabbing motion, despite the fact that he was holding a completely blunt weapon. Hanashiki. Neutra felt the world around him slow to a halt when Sarutobi said those words, and the lanky Espada found himself at a loss for words. Sarutobi was twirling his staff again, making it look somewhat like an acrobatic feat. It was a bizarre dance, for it seemed to cause some kind of illusion as he performed. 2 more staves had formed parallel to the one Sarutobi was holding, moving in tandem with the original. And when Sarutobi jabbed him, it had felt like he was hit by 3 blunt weapons that penetrated his iero on different parts of his body. His head snapped back when blood began leaking from the places he was struck, and 2 more vines wrapped around his wrists, reinforced by 2 more directly after. "I'll hold him, Sarutobi-sensei. Finish him off," Tsunade cried, almost desperately. Even with reinforced bindings, Neutra was already thrashing his way out of them, swinging his scythes with reckless abandon. "You whore. You fucking imitation hollow shit. Did you really think that this crap could hold me?" he roared, snapping the vines in half, and then doing something Tsunade would never expect. He pointed one arm at her, and the other at Sarutobi, who had halted in place. However, the scythes were nowhere near close enough to reach either of them. Tsunade winced as Neutra charged up his Ryatsu, launching both scythes with incredible force from the holes in his wrists, opting not to control them anymore. However, 2 more scythes had already grown back in their absence while the others were flying towards their targets. Tsunade trained her eyes, glimpsing a faint string of golden Ryatsu connected to the blade flying at her. "Sarutobi-sensei, watch it." Tsunade hit the deck, though Neutra wasn't particularly focused in on her. Sarutobi had sidestepped the blade, looking slightly surprised by the speed of it, and as a mark of experience, he thrust his staff out to the side. Neutra's eyes flashed with bloodlust, and he pulled the flying blade to the side, watching it clatter against Sarutobi's staff. With that already occurring, he ran forward, his other scythe poised to run through him. Sarutobi saw that coming, and used his superior agility to flip over Neutra. However, he sustained a serious wound to the side the moment he left himself defenseless, and blood fell from his side, creating a trail to where he landed. The impact had cracked his mask slightly. However, this was all according to plan. Before Sarutobi landed, he threw his shuriken in midair, where it hovered for just a moment. Kagebunshin. With the ode to Naruto's old jutsu, Sarutobi had concentrated his Ryatsu into the staff, allowing the weapon to split into 6 identical parts. With great force, Neutra found himself pinned in place by the staves, where they fell around him like bars of a prison cell. Sarutobi breathed out heavily, clutching his wound tightly. The maneuver had wounded him and left him without a weapon, but he had set up the Arrancar for the finishing blow. His student could take care of the rest. Tsunade, do you think you can finish him off? He trailed off, looking at the Aaron who was trying to slice through the bars of his prison, screaming profanities at the two of them. He wouldn't be held forever. Tsunade didn't even respond, but instead clapped her hands together. Her large Venus flytrap of a Bankai was usually stationary, but with enough effort. She could make it life if she concentrated enough, and that was exactly what she did in those moments. The large monolith of a plant glowed with Ryatsu as he was lifted up, its 7 vines thrashing uncontrollably. On its underside, a large hole to the thing's belly was seen, followed by a chamber filled with a green liquid in the direct center. With a steady hand, Tsunade guided it over to where Neutra was trapped. Sarutobi's staves were stronger than they looked, for even the Sexta's blades couldn't slice through them that quickly. Neutra's eyes widened as he saw a shadow fall over him, rapidly expanding as he tried to work his way out of the prison. That thing again. I've already defeated that thing before, you bitch. Whatever you throw at me now won't work. Neutra howled, turning his attention to the giant plant Bankai in an attempt to slice it up. Tsunade only regarded him with a poisonous stare, then muttered just a single word. Muro. Neutra cackled wildly, swinging his blades, but vines protruding from the underbelly of the plant wrapped around his blades and wrists, preventing him from even using them. A larger tendril from deep within the body of the flytrap wrapping around his midsection, and he roared in anger as the Bankai descended upon him, pulling the Sexta within the depths of its belly. Tsunade then released the Bankai, allowing it to crash fully to the ground. She placed her hands on the ground, allowing the plant material to reinforce itself several times, so that Neutra could not escape. There. Finished. That Arankar will not be able to escape now. Tsunade said, breathing a sigh of relief. Sarutobi turned to her, pulling down his mask and deactivating his shuriken. You bastards, you're dead. You're fucking dead. By some bitch-ass Shinigami. I can't lose to a bunch of bitch-ass Shinigami, a muffled cry resounded from within the plant, and the two of them plus Ino could see the Arankar stewing inside the green liquid. He already looked worse for wear. What is that? Tsunade-sama? Ino asked. Tsunade collapsed from exhaustion. Chamber is a technique where I trap an opponent within the central chamber of Rinne. The internal structure of Rinne contains the Ryoryoku that keeps my Bankai going. She paused for a moment. It's slow and difficult to perform, which is why I mostly use this technique after the enemy has been bound with Bakudo, or contained in some other manner. And using it drains nearly all my Ryatsu and leaves me useless for a time. But if I can capture the enemy within the central chamber, the battle is practically over. The enemy's body is dissolved by the highly concentrated Ryoryoku, and converted into more Ryoryoku via digestion. Tsunade explained. What a nasty ability. Ino thought, shuddering, before she turned her eyes to Neutra, trapped within the transparent folds. He was still screaming profanities, but his Ryatsu was being drained, and he already seemed to be dissolving. It was enough to make him drop his resurrection. Even still, he had stopped swearing eventually when he realized his fate, and for the first time as a hollow, he seemed to be at ease. Well, this is okay, isn't it? Dying in battle. He said, low enough that no one outside heard it. The flytrap churned, and soon Neutra was no more. The 3 remaining Shinigami watched in stony silence, as Neutra's body was dissolved. Tsunade stood there, panting. Her Ryatsu had been mostly drained. Tsunade, surely you've noticed that it doesn't end here? Sarutobi asked. Jiraiya's Ryatsu has disappeared, he told her. Tsunade coughed up a little blood from her previous injuries, then stared at her sensei. Yeah, that other Arankar that fell down is still fighting. I can sense someone else's Ryatsu, as well. I think it's Niji's. At this rate, he's going to die. Tsunade said. We don't have a way up to the Greater Soul Palace, but we need to fight off any enemy who is down here. That Arankar should be our next priority. Let's go, Tsunade. As soon as Grimmjow had put a hole the size of a basketball straight into Jiraiya, he was attacked by a golden, five-pronged trident. Nonetheless, Niji was nowhere near Grimmjow's level, so even if the Arrancar was focused on making sure Jiraiya was dead, he was easily able to avoid the trident. "Oh, I forgot that you're still here. You were so weak, it's like I forgot you existed for a moment there." Grimmjow deadpanned, blocking the trident with his elbow blades. "Be quiet. As long as I'm here, I'll be able to keep you from going after any of my comrades." The extra prongs on Niji's trident were pointed at Grimmjow's neck, though he hardly seemed concerned by them. He thrust himself forward, his protect neck area clanging against the metal of Niji's Zanpakuto, before he grabbed the vice-captain's face. Pulling a few hairs from their roots, he flung the Shinigami away with a quick throw, apparently content to keep Niji around as a punching bag. For all he was worth, Niji at least managed to recover at a breakneck pace, balancing himself in mid-air while preparing for Grimmjow's next attack. Of course, it wasn't worth much when Grimmjow got on top of him before he knew it and broke his Zanpakuto with a quick jab of his claws. After the pieces of gold flew through the air, Grimmjow placed a claw around Niji's throat, pushing him into the ground and restricting his movements. Grimmjow grinned, his bloodthirsty nature shining through in his blue eyes. Most logic had already been erased from his visage, and at this distance, Niji could see just how much of an animal he really was. Niji felt his hot breath on his face, but it seemed fortune would smile on him at least long for him to buy more time. While he was pinned down, something had hit Grimmjow hard enough to knock him off of Niji. The panther went flying, not being as durable as Neutra, when he got hit by a thick green pole that seemed to extend from nowhere. When Niji took a look, he thought his eyes were deceiving him. "Sandaime-sama?" he asked, more to himself than the old man. The old Vazard had deserted Soul Society a long time ago. What was he doing here now? "Who the fuck are you?" Grimmjow grunted, feeling slightly disoriented as he got back to his feet. A low growl emerged from his throat as he saw the familiar-looking mask that the old man was wearing. "Sit this one out, Tsunade. I think I can handle this one alone." Bankai. Sarutobi held the staff at a complete vertical angle, thrusting it toward the sky. His bright red Ryatsu got stronger than ever before, and Grimmjow heard a sound like a faint breeze rustling some kind of tree. The sound grew to a heavy whine, before Sarutobi jammed the end of his staff directly into the ground, still glowing with his Ryatsu. "This is the trunk," he muttered to himself. Grimmjow didn't hear him. Sarutobi took a step back from the metal pole stuck in the ground, as it expanded to the thickness of about a tree trunk, staying rooted in the ground. Near the top of the pole, smaller poles began branching off from the center, much like the branches of a tree, crossing over each other and giving it more resemblance to a type of strange metal tree. Genii. Grimmjow looked at the strange, green metal tree that was rising out of the stone floor. Strange as it was, it didn't exactly look that threatening considering it was completely immobile. "What do you plan to do with that thing? You still never answered my question. Who the hell are you, and why are you wearing that mask?" Grimmjow growled, pointing a claw at Sarutobi. "Who I am personally is unimportant. Even though I may look different than a normal Shinigami, I am on the side of my former friends and students. That is all you need to know, Arrancar-kun." "Oh, really?" Grimmjow said, a vein popping in his forehead. "Then all you need to know is that I'm gonna kill you." Grimmjow roared, rushing at Sarutobi. Niji was completely forgotten at that point. Sarutobi only placed a hand on the green metal beside him. Grimmjow was fast, no, he was a speed demon. But, his Bankai was no slouch in that department either, despite appearances. Grimmjow continued on with using his Sonido, but as he came in close to the Bankai, the nearest branch to him extended outward at a speed that was almost capable of matching his Sonido. 3 quick flashes later, and Grimmjow had avoided the strike, but in doing so he had put himself in a position to collide with several more branches that were extending before he was even there. There was a clatter of motion as the metal spires whizzed by him, and there were so many branches moving around that the entire process was becoming more and more like a maze. Meanwhile, Sarutobi just stood at the bottom while Grimmjow tried to reach him, subconsciously controlling the poles. "Now!" Sarutobi said, clenching his fist against the green metal. The metal branches worked across one another as if they were rope, tying knots together to prevent the speedy Aaron from moving in any direction. "Too easy!" Grimmjow roared. He brought his claws together, and when he did, strange blue lines of Ryuryoku emerged from his claws, cutting through the green metal like butter and heading straight for Sarutobi. "Descaron!" Sarutobi's eyes widened underneath his mask at the sheer power of the energy claws heading straight for him. Quick as a flash, one of the branches from a tree shot forward to shield him, but there were 5 total, and he was forced to move away from the tree and dodge. With its master not touching it, the tree fell limp. The Descaron had propelled Grimmjow out of the thick of the Bankai's attack range, and he hovered in the air for a moment, analyzing. His feral blue eyes darted between the old man and the Bankai, before a sadistic grin lit up his face. "I get it. The second you stopped touching it, that Bankai of yours went lifeless. A big-ass weakness like that, and you call that thing a Bankai? It's practically a death knell." Grimmjow roared, forming another pair of Descaron and slashing his claws down. "I don't have a weapon," Sarutobi thought. He knew that his Bankai's biggest weakness was that he had to be in contact with it to control it, and that if he were ever drawn away, he would be weaponless. Thinking quickly, he used Shunpa to try to get back to his position on the tree, though the blue claws that crashed down in front of him as he did so made it clear that the Aaron wasn't going to let that happen. Strangely enough, they ricocheted off the stone ground and shot toward him. Sarutobi's reflexes made him duck to the right to avoid the centermost claw heading for him, but the blue energy cut into his shoulder, leaving a trail of blood as the Ryuryoku hummed. Grimmjow broke off the connection of his claws, seeing they had impacted, but Sarutobi thrust his shoulder forward, breaking free of the Ryatsu that slashed into his shoulder. He had an attack he wanted to use, but it wouldn't work unless he was touching the tree. Hada number 33, Sokatsui. He pointed a hand at Grimmjow, who was still doing his best to prevent him from reaching his Bankai once again. With almost every aspect of his abilities magnified by the hollow mask, the blue fire that he launched from his fingertips spread across the ground like wildfire, engulfing the battlefield in flames as it actually took out several hollows in the distance. Grimmjow looked only slightly burned, but he had been forced to take refuge away from the main brunt of the blast, allowing Sarutobi to put his hand back onto the trunk of the tree without issue. When he channeled the Ryatsu into the tree once more, it was like the Bankai came back to life within a split second. 2 branches groaned under the weight of the entire thing, but they still extended toward Grimmjow, even faster than before. Grimmjow was tired of dodging at that point, and delivered a nasty kick to the pole that was headed his way. That turned out to be a mistake on his part. While his arrow prevented any broken bones, the poles were made of a hard enough material and coated with enough Ryatsu to break through arrow anyway, and when he kicked it, it was jarring enough to knock him back. He lost his balance in midair, his sonito failing him at the moment while he was disoriented. That meant that more branches were liable to extend straight at him. One of them clipped the side of his head as he just barely managed to balance himself enough to move. But he was hit in the stomach by another one heading directly at him around the same time, cracking the armor directly near his hole. 4 more came afterwards, shaped like they were some sort of grid, another one extending perpendicularly across the others as it too snaked its way toward Grimmjow. Sarutobi wasn't finished yet, though, and Grimmjow was being battered on all sides by a variety of metal poles that seemed to have a life of their own. Even with his sonito, the Bankai was quick for something that looked so unwieldy, and Sarutobi seemed to control virtually every aspect of the tree perfectly. Roared! Sarutobi halted in place, and so did Tsunade and Ino off to the side. Grimmjow's scream hung in the air, charged with Ryatsu, as the metal poles seemed to fall lifeless around them. He locked eyes with Sarutobi, a look of pure rage on his face. He was stained with blood, having endured several hits from the metal monstrosity, and was panting with a low growl. "You old shit! Did you think you had me on edge? That you were going to beat me?" he growled, trailing off. With that last attack, he finished with a loud roar. He wasn't done screaming, however. Decreto del Jaguar. He only whispered those words, before the seventh espada took a deep breath and roared a blue Ryatsu-laden sound wave, stronger than any of the screams he may have done earlier. Everyone in the blast radius was heavily affected. What an enormous blast! Tsunade thought, over to the side. She had covered her ears, but she felt a warm liquid leak from her ears regardless. Both of her eardrums had been shattered. Looking over, Ino was having a worse time. It was to be expected, she had the least Ryatsu out of all of them. Still, she didn't expect her head to explode as it did, and she stood in shock as Ino's gray matter splattered over the area. They were farther away from the blast, but Sarutobi had protected his hearing with his hollow mask and a protective barrier of Ryatsu. However, hearing loss was not the only effect of Grimmjow's sonic scream. Cuts starting to materialize all over the unprotected areas on Sarutobi's body, clearly from the Ryatsu mixed in with the sound waves. Despite suffering no less than a dozen deep cuts, Sarutobi did not take his hand off the tree. However, the tree began to make a low groaning noise when affected by the scream, and many of the limbs began to collapse upon themselves. The green metal was being destroyed, and Grimmjow was ready to take the advantage. "Lights out, shitty old man," he roared, as he rushed Sarutobi. Without anything else to do, Sarutobi attempted his secret attack. Nah! Sarutobi blinked, and Grimmjow's claw was pointed just barely an inch from his face, twitching lightly from some unseen force. When he laid eyes on Grimmjow, he knew that his technique had worked. A dozen spiky green poles had sprouted up out of the ground from the area, each of them thick enough to fatally puncture a body. One of them had been driven through Grimmjow's outstretched arm, and the other 11 throughout his torso. He had been impaled, all the spikes sticking out his backside. "Wrath!" he growled, choking up blood as he attempted to speak. Even now, the most he could do was twitch. Sarutobi sighed, that had been too close of a call. Grimmjow attempted to thrash while being skewered on the poles, but it was no good. Doing that would only further drive them into his internal organs. "Fuck you. Cheap-ass trick. I can't lose." Grimmjow snarled at Sarutobi, hate filling his expression. Even that close to death, he was still a fiery competitor. The poles retracted, retreating into the stone ground as Grimmjow flopped uselessly to the ground in a puddle of his own blood. Tsunade was walking up now, but Grimmjow wasn't concerned with them. His eyes were focused on nothing at this point, and he thought back on how he got in this situation. He remembered his time as an Ajuchas, wandering the sands of Huecomundo, to meeting Naruto and joining the Reino animal. He had gotten so much power by doing so, but in the end, he was not able to crush everything and proclaim his inherent superiority to the world. "Thanks a lot, Naruto," he thought, only semi-sarcastically. And with that, the Septima Espada passed away. Sarutobi pulled down the mask from his face, turning to Tsunade. Her hearing was still damaged, but luckily Tsunade would be able to heal them in due time. He looked down at Ino with sad eyes. She wasn't ready to be a part of a battle like this, and it had cost her her life. Sarutobi turned to face the sky, and then turned to see the ragtag group of himself, Tsunade, and Niji. The image of the town was getting clearer and clearer, and there was no way for him and his companions to reach the greater palace. They needed to find a way out of here, to find refuge and trust in Minato and Kushina up above. Resurrección, Segunda Etapa. The cloak of greenish-black Ryatsu surrounding the morphing Ulquiorra dispersed with a wave of a skinny, black arm, and the Segunda Espada now looked as demonic as his opponent. Ulquiorra fiddled with the ripped cloth that covered his legs, as a strange black liquid leaked from his hollow hole. His eyes were black, with two vicious curved horns protruding out of his head. He did not materialize an energy lance in his hand. Ichigo did nothing more than breathe heavily, clutching his Sanpakto in his hand. Ulquiorra's tail whipped backwards, and the hollowified Ichigo felt a hand push him on the head suddenly. Ulquiorra had disappeared. Ulquiorra's speed had increased dramatically, to the point where he could even keep up with the fully released Hollow Ichigo. Ulquiorra grunted slightly. The hollowified Shinigami was heavier than expected, but he was still bowled over as Ulquiorra flew by him and pushed him to the ground, creating a crater where he impacted. His black Sunpokdo flew out of his hands, but Hollow Ichigo was sturdy and quickly found it while grabbing Ulquiorra's tail before the Segunda could escape fully. The Arrancar's eyes didn't even flash with emotion as he was pulled towards Ichigo, the black blade heading directly toward his skull. Ulquiorra raised a hand quietly, his reflexes just enough to keep up with Ichigo. A flash of green energy emerged from his palm, redirecting the black sword and sending it crashing to the ground once again. With his deed done, he swerved at a 90-degree angle, taking a fast approach to the sky before flapping his wings and hovering there, looking down upon his opponent. Naruto's Ryatsu was blanketing the entire palace area, but it wasn't so smothering that Ulquiorra couldn't recognize the Ryatsu of others, especially when it spiked. And the unmistakable feel of a Zero being charged up filled the atmosphere. It was different than the one he had fired before, colored both red and white, with the unmistakable feel of two Ryatsu layers coating it. Ulquiorra mulled over his options, and decided that the Zero Oscuras was out. The Ryoryoku was practically screaming when Ichigo charged up that Zero, and before his Zero Oscuras had just cancelled out the boy's weaker Zero. But his speed and agility had increased when he activated his Segunda Etapa, and he was nearly unstoppable once he got in the air. That was, of course, until Ichigo actually fired the Zero. It wasn't like other Zeros. It actually exploded upon contact with the air, making the finished attack look less like a beam and more like a blast. Ulquiorra himself was engulfed in the blaze of fire, actually having been caught off guard by the sheer power of the Zero. He had started flapping his wings earlier to avoid the brunt of the blast radius, but when he emerged from the smoke and fire, he was scalded in many areas of his body. Impossible. That was the closest thing I've seen to a Zero Doble in a long time, but he didn't swallow an opponent's Zero and merge it with his own. It was already like 2-0. Ulquiorra glanced down at the hollow hole in Ichigo's chest. When had that developed? With an apprehensive approach, Ulquiorra decided to test for further abilities that the former human may have. Ichigo was simply standing there, growling up at Ulquiorra as he pointed a finger down at the unstable stone bridge. It was another Zero Oscuras, predictably powered up by his second release. Ichigo stuck out a white hand, and Ulquiorra's eyes narrowed as he clutched the powerful Zero in his palm as if it were nothing, clenching his fist around it and fizzling it out. The Segunda surveyed the scene below closely, seemingly unaffected that one of his strongest attacks could be dispelled by little more than a palm swipe. Interesting. He seems to use a form of Iero that may in fact be stronger than any espada. The fact that my Zero Oscuras proved ineffective at least lends credence to the fact that he has a very high-level defense. Yet. He trailed off when Ichigo appeared in his blind, apparently capable of hovering as well. He hefted his blade over his shoulder, and Ulquiorra could hear the Ryatsu screaming to cut. He backflipped over the blade, but Ichigo reached out with a free hand and grabbed a wing, holding Ulquiorra aloft in an awkward position. It was at this point that Ulquiorra decided to bring out his Luz de la Luna. While Ichigo grasped him in mid-air, the green energy lance emerged from Ulquiorra's hand, creating a small cut on Ichigo's wrist from the contact and forcing him to drop the Arrancar. Ulquiorra's wings started flapping, and he took off in a barrel roll around Ichigo, almost coaxing him to follow. He fired 2 quick ballists, knowing that they would be nothing more than a challenge and a distraction, considering they bounced off the hollow plate harmlessly. Unfortunately for him, Ichigo's Sonido allowed him to slip completely through his pesquisa and get behind him. Ulquiorra heard chains rattling from the black sword as Ichigo went for a fatal stab to the heart without hesitation, but Ulquiorra's own Sonido allowed him to avoid the blow, even if Ichigo was 2 steps ahead with another flash, this time slashing his sword down across Ulquiorra's torso. Ulquiorra grunted as he took 2 flashes backward, the deep wound slashed diagonally from his shoulder leaking an unhealthy amount of blood. He raised a claw, gathering some green energy in it. He missed my internal organs, but he's managing to slip right between my pesquisa. He's keeping up with me far too easily, I'll have to fatally wound him here soon. His wound was already beginning to heal, so without much concern for it, Ulquiorra cupped his hands together, forming more green Ryuryoku. He pulled his right arm out, creating another type of lance, one that was much longer and more arrow-shaped than Luz de la Luna. Lanza del Relámpago. He twirled his strongest technique in his hands, judging the distance between him and Ichigo. It was too close. He didn't like throwing it at such a close distance. His hole. I'll aim for that. The most vulnerable part of a hollow's body, and he's leaving it wide open. His lance whirred with power as he beat his wings faster, dive-bombing at Ichigo before using Sonido. Ichigo saw him coming fairly easily, blocking the strike with his own blade as they stared each other down, Ulquiorra looking into the blank holes of Ichigo's mask. Ichigo thrust his sword forward, and Ulquiorra shifted to the right. They danced in mid-air with Sonido for a few seconds, Ulquiorra trying to fight his way back on the offensive with some heavy strikes from his lance. A heavy Ryatsu from neither of the combatants filled the area, followed by another one shortly afterward. Ulquiorra opened his pesquisa, and out of the corner of his eye he saw two more Shinigami heading down the stone bridge to his position. More enemies, and they're strong. I already have my hands full from Kurosaki Ichigo, he thought. It wouldn't be advisable to fight 3-on-1 with opponents of unknown abilities. With the mindset that he needed to end this quickly, Ulquiorra opened his mouth. Though he normally fired zeros from his fingertips, he was perfectly capable of firing one in the more natural way. A large zero Oscuras formed in his mouth, and Ichigo didn't have time to react when Ulquiorra fired it point blank at him. Black and green energy swarmed around him. He was unharmed by it all, but when he was able to see again, Ulquiorra had disappeared. There was the noise of a Sonido, followed by pain blossoming in his chest. Ichigo growled lowly. Ulquiorra had appeared off to the side, wings outstretched as he barreled towards him in the confusion. With Ulquiorra at his maximum speed, he flew by Ichigo and carved a wound across Ichigo's hollow hole with his Lanza del Relámpago. Ichigo's torso was flaming in pain as he was slashed through the chest, but he didn't fall. He wasn't quite dead yet, his hollow form was far too durable for something like that to happen. Still, it was amazing that Ulquiorra was even able to slice through the hollowified Ichigo's arrow. He could grab a zero in the palm of his hand and even take one point blank without so much of a scratch on him. The Lanza del Relámpago was strong. The Arrancar had continued flying when he sliced Ichigo's chest, looking over his shoulder to survey the former Shinigami. Ichigo just stood in mid-air and watched, scarcely moving a muscle. "Don't underestimate me. I can still find a way to cut you down," Ulquiorra said, the beating of his wings louder than ever. The Lanza del Relámpago was still clutched in his hand. "Ichigo-san." Ulquiorra's blackened eyes were staring down the two Shinigami who were now close enough to actually see and hear the battle. The bridge around them was still collapsing, but Ulquiorra realized that he had just lost the advantage with the caliber of opponents that stood before him now. "Those two are far above captain level, and I have just managed to grab the advantage with only one opponent. Naruto needs more time, but at this rate I will not be able to give it to him. Unless..." Ulquiorra looked down at the lance he was clutching in his hand, and noticed that there now seemed to be a fair bit of distance between himself and Ichigo. Not to mention, with his own flying abilities, it didn't particularly matter if the bridge collapsed or not. Minato and Kushina had caught up to them, balking when they saw the changed hollow that was once Ichigo. He looked them over, not saying a word, and they couldn't even tell if they were making eye contact with that strange mask. "Kurosaki Ichigo, you are no hollow. You may have the appearance of one, you may be able to use all of our abilities to an even greater extent, but you will never be a hollow. Do you understand why?" Ulquiorra paused. "It's because you will never have the attitude of one." Ichigo finally flinched when he realized that Ulquiorra was not aiming his lance at him, but instead was looking to throw it directly down upon the bridge and collapse it, right next to where Minato and Kushina were. Lanza del Relámpago. Ulquiorra launched the lance like an arrow, the projectile weapon spinning through the air as fast as Ulquiorra's arm strength would allow, which was typically pretty strong. Ichigo only watched it for a split second, already knowing where it was heading. Minato and Kushina spotted the Eren car as well, and the lance he launched at them. Ichigo wasted no time in speeding off, praying that his Sonido would allow him to make it in time. He dropped his sword, allowing it to jam into the stone bridge as he cast his arms out. Just before the attack could hit and destroy the bridge, Ichigo grabbed the very end of the lance, holding the energy weapon in his bare hands. He growled with compassion, not even wincing as it seared his hands. He couldn't control it like Ulquiorra could, the foreign Ryatsu just wouldn't let him. Even now, it moved and whirred around, as if it were begging to be released from its prison. But if it detonated here? Ichigo-san! What are you doing? Minato called out to him. They had seen the attack coming, and though they didn't know what it did, it seemed that Ichigo got it in his mind that he needed to protect both of them. An action that was clearly unnecessary. Smart move. You wouldn't have prevented the bridge from collapsing otherwise. However, you do not understand the sheer magnitude of power that the Lanza del Relámpago possesses. Ulquiorra chimed in, disappearing with a burst of sonido. Minato, do something. Kushina shouted at him, but it was too late. Ichigo's quick instincts made out Ulquiorra just as he come out of his sonido, and he promptly noticed the new lance that he was clutching in his hand. He already knew that he needed to prevent him from detonating that one over the bridge as well, but he was already holding one. With a flourish of his wrist, Ichigo threw the Lanza del Relámpago over off the edge of the bridge. Gravity took hold of it, and it soared over the edge into the battlefield below, where a myriad of hollows still battled the royal guard. There was the sound of a heavy thumping, before the world lit up. The sky was practically bleeding green as the pillar of purely destructive energy rose from the ground. The cries and screams of hollows could be heard from below as they were vaporized from the blast. The attack had taken out a good chunk of Naruto's army, even if there was a horde of hollows still remaining. In all that, Ichigo made a fatal error that Ulquiorra had calculated when he threw the lance. While being unavoidable, protecting the bridge while catching his Lanza left him wide open for subsequent attacks. If he were a true hollow, he would have not bothered trying to save Minato and Kushina. Ichigo never talked in his full hollow form, and his masked face never betrayed any emotion. Yet despite all that, inside he was a whirling torment of emotion, as he saw the tip of Ulquiorra's Lanza del Relámpago get closer and closer to him. A second later, and Ulquiorra had thrust his lance directly through Ichigo's hollow hole. Time seemed to stand at a still, as Minato and Kushina watched in shock as Ichigo was punctured through the torso. Ulquiorra held his position, prepared to detonate the Lanza at any given time. The green energy glowed, but Ichigo felt no pain. However, he knew that he was in a bad situation. Try to attack, and Ulquiorra would set off the lance. With a destructive power that great, even he would be killed by it. Ichigo-san! Minato shouted, trying to come to his aid with a shuinpa. You are too late. In situations like this, I can concentrate the power of the Lanza del Relámpago into a much smaller form, allowing me to detonate it without any harm coming to myself. Kurosaki Ichigo, you will have lost your life because of your desire to imitate Hollow-kind in all ways but one. Ulquiorra droned, only vaguely concerned about the rapidly approaching Minato. Lanza del Relámpago. Ulquiorra released the lance. There was the whirring noise of energy, as the Segunda Espada allowed his attack to blossom outward from within Ichigo's hollow hole. It was on a much smaller scale, but Minato and Kushina could see the concentrated Ryatsu behind that attack. The energy erupted outward in a green pillar similar to the previous one, and Ichigo's body was paying the price. The heat and power from the attack cracked the armor and mask he was wearing, and they fell to the floor in small chunks. When his horns fell, and the mask completely split open, Ichigo's face was visible yet again, a look of anguish on his face barely visible underneath the shroud of the green Ryuryoku. The young Shinigami's skin began to peel away, and a vacant look entered his eyes as Ulquiorra threw him over the bridge to be scraps for the hollows below. You have been a thorn in our side for far too long, Kurosaki Ichigo. You should have stayed in Huecomundo and tried to eke out an existence there, pitiful as it may have been. And now, you have died with nothing, for no purpose whatsoever." Upon reflex, his wing thrust out, blocking a sword strike from Minato's sealed Zanpakuto. Apparently, the 5th Division's captain had finally caught up, but it was too little too late. The Segunda spun, thrusting Minato off of him to fall back to earth. There was a light gash on his right wing, the least durable part of his entire body, but Ulquiorra shrugged it off as it began to regenerate. Bankai! An explosion of Ryatsu rocked the stone bridge even more, as electric yellow Ryatsu crackled and came dangerously close to hitting Ulquiorra. The Segunda stood stoically, watching the former Hokage rise up in a pillar of light. Kinten no Raijin. Minato rode up the pillar of lightning that had crashed down, coming to rest upon the cloud of lightning that had formed at about the same height as Ulquiorra. Well, that technique solves the issue of flying. Ulquiorra muttered, seeing that Minato would not leave his perch in the heavens from this point on. Ulquiorra was about to attack, but the sound of movement behind him drew his attention elsewhere, to which he saw Kushina, a puddle of blood covering her like a cloak. Bankai! Akashi no Hanawa! She had materialized a red whip to use as a weapon, and she struck Ulquiorra directly in the wing. The woman was cloaked in a shroud of boiling blood, looking like the demonic goddess that had slayed Haribel not too long before. "I'm going to kill you," she said evenly, without a hint of hatred or anger in her voice. Ulquiorra kept his stoic face, but his wing was scalding where Kushina had hit it, and much of the flesh had been boiled away. "I'm going to kill you, and find Naruto." This time Kushina said it with emotion, and fury and bloodlust were present behind her gray eyes. Minato simply stood in his cloud, which was beginning to crackle with energy. Tenbatsu! Ulquiorra's eyes snapped open when Kushina said those words, expecting something along the lines of a special ability to be shown here. Judging from her cloak, her Bankai was scalding hot. Direct attacks are hindering, and there's the matter of the other Shinigami behind her. Ulquiorra thought, not forgetting about Minato's Bankai. Looking before he leapt would be the only way he'd be able to fight off 2 Bankais at once. The cloak on Kushina's body morphed into a wave of boiling blood, fully intent on searing Ulquiorra straight to the bone. However, Ulquiorra dive-bombed when Kushina crashed it down on him, proving that the attack was much less effective in the air. Kushina growled, frustrated about missing the Eren car. Seizing the opportunity to move, she gathered her Bankai back in the shape of a cloak, darting up to meet Ulquiorra in mid-sonito to try and whip him around the waist. He flashed away, a Lanza del Relampago appearing in his hand. She reformed the tidal wave of blood, forcing Ulquiorra to focus on that, and to keep herself from taking a concentrated lance of energy. Wait a second, there's a weakness in her Bankai. I just need to confirm the truth about it. Ulquiorra thought. With his free hand, he charged up a fully powered Ciro Oscurus, keeping the Lanza del Relampago clenched in his other hand. Kushina flinched upon her perch at the top of the wave of blood. He wasn't backing down even when she was in a position to attack. The Ryatsu around her own body is fluctuating, and the cloak she's wearing is not as thick. If I aim for her right now, it may confirm my hypothesis. Ulquiorra's mind was working a mile a minute, and when he released the Ciro, Kushina's eyes widened and she retracted the tidal wave, creating an extra thick layer of blood that she wrapped around herself. Kushina couldn't get away in time, and the Ciro Oscurus impacted her cloak. Ulquiorra's eyes narrowed when the blood began to boil away even the Ciro Oscurus. It was a strange Bankai, but Kushina had looked vulnerable beforehand, and when she wanted to defend, she retracted the wave of blood back into its cloak form. Just as I thought. She spreads her Ryatsu out into that blood-like form. However, since she has a limited amount, she is far less protected when she decides to attack with it. With a strong attack, she sacrifices defense. With a strong defense, she sacrifices attack. Meaning that she is the most vulnerable when she is switching between her attack state and her defensive state. However, even if she's in her defensive state, it's unlikely it can fully absorb my Lanza del Relampago. I could wait for her to shift to her attack phase before striking, or I can hit her now when she feels that she's at her safest. Ulquiorra didn't have the chance to do anything yet, as he saw a glimmer out of the corner of his eye while he was analyzing Kushina. There was a flash of movement, and now Minato's lightning cloud Bankai was directly behind Ulquiorra. That thing is mobile? No matter, he has not attacked me directly with it yet. Ulquiorra didn't dare take his eyes off Kushina, but he kept focus on Minato in the corner of his eye, trying to find the perfect balance where he could watch and analyze both of them. Then Minato swung down his bladeless Sunpakuto. A blast of lightning rocketed out from the cloud, arcing toward Ulquiorra like it was a spear. Ulquiorra was surprised by how quick it was, and his Sonito was just barely enough for him to avoid getting pierced through. "TCH, missed him," Minato said. Ulquiorra reappeared in a flash, firing a quick Zero Oscuras over to Minato's position. Minato looked surprised for a moment, and steered his Bankai out of the way. Defense and mobility were not strong suits of his Bankai. For him, it was all about the destructive attack power that his lightning provided in this state. If Ulquiorra had the ability to avoid them. Minato locked eyes with his wife, and held up 2 fingers in a silent motion. Ulquiorra noticed this, but Minato was confident that he did not know what any of their secret signals meant. Without a word, Kushina flashed forward, this time conjuring up a sword made out of blood. The liquid blade gleamed in the sunlight, and altogether it looked deadlier than even her whip Shirkai. Ulquiorra held his lance out, and flapped his wings to get himself some good speed. The Arankar and Shinigami met in a clash of red and green, Ulquiorra's lance meeting Kushina's blood sword. Ulquiorra released more of his Ryatsu, slashing with his lance at Kushina, who backflipped over the strike and swung her sword directly down in a vertical slice with no wasted motion. Ulquiorra blocked it with his lance, droplets of the blood flinging off of Kushina's cloak and sword. Her face was marred in a twisted scowl, and she tried to no avail to overpower the Segunda. Ulquiorra thought, as he felt heat transmit through his lanza up to his hands. His lance was apparently good enough of a conductor to where the scalding heat of the boiling blood sword could travel up it, even being hot enough to burn his hands. He threw Kushina off of him, shifting his lance from one hand to another, while he looked over his burnt hand. Kushina's Bankai seemed to be strange, it was almost like a poison. He couldn't regenerate from this properly. Kushina was charging at him again, and she delivered a quick flurry of strikes with her blade. Ulquiorra sidestepped and dodged over every one, his wings and agility coming to his aid in this situation. He could feel the heel resonate from off the blade. Kushina just stood there with a grim visage on her face, coated in red. However, while he was focused on Kushina, he heard a crackling noise too little too late come from directly behind him. He turned around just to see a bolt of lightning pierce him directly through the liver, clipping the bat hollow like a bird being hunted. Damn it! Ulquiorra thought, his eyes wavering and a slight bit of emotion entering his face. His wings failed him, and as he looked between Minato and Kushina, he plummeted to the stone bridge below. He got one of my internal organs. That's something I won't be able to regenerate from at this rate. Luckily, the wound isn't great enough to be fatal for me. As long as I can avoid more blows to internal organs. Ulquiorra lay there, eyes half-lidded as he stared up at Minato and Kushina. He sighed, his disappointed breath mixing into the wind. He had come a long way since the day he met Naruto. Ulquiorra. The small, bat-like Ajuchas was sitting on a stone ledge, overlooking the grassland down below. It had been over a month since he had been defeated, and he and Naruto set off to form their own kingdom. Ulquiorra said nary a word, looking over his shoulder to see the fox-like Ajuchas walking up to him. The quadruped approached slowly, the look of usual manic ever present in his eyes. What are you doing here? We need to move on. Naruto growled. It's nothing, Naruto. Contemplating my own meaningless existence. You know the reason why I joined you, right? I told you that it wasn't because of the promise of power or social status, Ulquiorra replied. Naruto stared off into the distance, a neutral look in his eyes. You've lived nothing but a meaningless existence up to this point. You were hoping to change that by joining me. Ulquiorra didn't respond. Listen to me, Ulquiorra. I'm going to tell you what I want. What I want isn't friends, comrades, or love. We're both hollows. You should understand why I want jack shit to do with concepts like those. What I do want is tools. He trailed off for a second. I want weapons. Hollows with power who will fight for me and never question it. Naruto sat down next to Ulquiorra. I don't know what your definition of meaning is, but I will tell you right now. I don't care about you. When we joined forces, I figured we were both understanding that this was all about power. Well, what I want is undying loyalty in you. I want you to fight for me, and if it comes down to it, die for me. Perhaps if you stretch it a little, you can consider something like that meaning. Naruto finished talking, the tone in his voice never changing. Ulquiorra felt nothing when Naruto told him that. He knew as a hollow the things that Naruto was after, and he had already lost to him once. Finding meaning may never be any different than loyalty. Perhaps Naruto was right. It's been so long, perhaps I forgot the reason I joined Naruto in the first place. Ulquiorra dragged himself to his feet. The Lanza del Relampago had dissipated when he had been knocked down, and blood was still leaking from his liver wound. Thinking about the past, that's for humans. Who cares about what happened so long ago? I need to delay both of these Shinigami from reaching the Greater Palace. At any other time, Ulquiorra wouldn't even have been thinking about such trivial events. It was strange to him. He had been feeling different ever since Kurosaki Ichigo had found him. He stared at his white hands, wiping the blood off of them. A resolute look entered his features. It normally wasn't his manner to fight with a sense of emotion, but perhaps. He clenched his hands together, before unclenching them. Pure, black Ryatsu had coated his fingertips, little pieces of the energy flowing off of them as if it were a pouring rain. Luvia oscura. He then disappeared. Kushina, watch out. He got faster. Kushina withdrew all of her bloody bankai within herself, adding layer upon layer to her cloak. Ulquiorra appeared directly in front of her, hurling himself over a swing from her blood sword and slashing his Ryatsu-laden nails into her shoulder. It should be known at this point that Kushina pretty much expects her defense to hold up in the face of anything. The blood is so hot that usually anything that strikes it is destroyed or repelled. So, it stood to reason that she was surprised when Ulquiorra's fingers penetrated her defense and stabbed into her shoulder rather easily, leaving behind 4 mid-sized holes that leaked blood. Her blood shield retracted for just a moment, allowing Ulquiorra to kick his taloned foot out and nail her directly in the stomach. She went flying downwards, just missing the edge of the bridge and landing in a deep crater. Kushina! Minato whispered, seeing his wife gingerly climbing out of the crater, a look of white-hot rage in her eyes as she clutched her bleeding shoulder. Wisps of black Ryatsu were leaking out of the wound. Minato grimaced. She was taking some time to get back to her feet. With a heavy grunt, Minato lifted his bladeless sword, sticking it down deep into the Ryatsu core of his bankai. When he pulled it out, it was identical to his shuriken. Seeing Ulquiorra in his blind spot, he swung the sword out while generating lightning within his Ryatsu cloud. The tip of his blade met Ulquiorra's fingers, the darkness coating the Arrancar's hands was protecting him, and to make matters worse, he was pushing through. Ulquiorra's eyes darted down when a bolt of lightning curved from the underside of the cloud, trying to hook through Ulquiorra. Ulquiorra had conjured a luz de la luna in his right hand, swinging it around to block the lightning bolt while keeping another hand on Minato's sword. When the arc of lightning passed, Ulquiorra released the luz de la luna, using his free hand in an attempt to thrust right through Minato's heart. The Arrancar's black eyes glowed for a moment, when Minato was forced to leave his perch and leap back to the very edge of his bankai, as Ulquiorra's hand thrust right through the cloud. He's not being shocked. Minato thought. He tenderly noted that Ulquiorra made sure that only his black Ryatsu-coated fingertips were touching the cloud portion of his bankai. Wait, both with Kushina and myself, he has ignored powerful defenses to attack us barehanded. In any other situation, he should have been burned by Kushina or shocked by me, but he stands there unharmed. What is the point of deliberately keeping just his hand within the sphere of my Bankai? Minato shifted back forward. That attack, does it some sort of defense ignoring properties? It would explain why he was unharmed. Quick as a flash, Minato threw his sword out like a boomerang, to which Ulquiorra flashed out of the way to avoid it. Now swordless, Minato knew that he didn't have much time. His sword would cycle around, but that throw was only a distraction. He thrust his hands into his Cloud Bankai, charging up Ryatsu in a vortex of yellow. He then thrust them out, lifting them like they were a liquid, and firing lightning at his opponent. This time, it was less like a bolt and more like a blast, given the scope and the scale of the attack. The first one sailed right over Ulquiorra when the Arrancar decided to dodge, but it was becoming more difficult when Minato fired 6 more blasts of lightning at his target. Ulquiorra grimaced. Minato was capable of firing blasts of lightning rapid fire, to the point where a quick sonido was all he could do to avoid being obliterated by the Bankai. He hadn't forgotten about the sword that Minato threw, and even anticipated that it may come back. However, with lightning being fired at him from all angles, there was really nothing he could do to avoid it. Shit! He thought, narrowing his eyes while still avoiding the rapid-fire bursts of lightning that were heading straight at him. However, the twirling sword of lightning spun around when it reached its peak. Ulquiorra didn't even flinch when it sliced a wing off as if it were made of butter, coming back to position next to its master. Minato smiled lightly, even as the fleshy stump that was once Ulquiorra's left wing began to knit itself back together. With only one wing, it would be harder to maintain balance in midair. Ulquiorra seemed to realize this, and he made a move to ground himself, still bleeding from the stump. Minato followed him down, his cloud following after the Arrancar. Ulquiorra touched down upon the ground, blood leaking down from his wing stump to create a puddle upon the ground. His hands were still glowing with the Luvia Oscura. When Minato stepped off his cloud, he grabbed his sword. And with his free hand, he thrust into the cloud and materialized a lightning bolt with his Ryatsu, pulling it free from the cloud. With sword in one hand and lightning bolt in another, he charged Ulquiorra. The two of them practically danced with each other as Minato led the attack with his energy sword, Ulquiorra countering with his Luvia Oscura, which allowed him to touch the edge of the blade. Ulquiorra still had to watch out for the energy that was created wherever Minato sliced, as his Shurikai would create a trail of lightning directly where he had just sliced. For example, Minato started with a vertical slice, then a horizontal one, followed by 2 diagonal ones in opposite direction. The result was a star-shaped Ryatsu attack, and one that Ulquiorra had to use Sonido to avoid. Minato then followed up with a strike from his lightning bolt, trying to press the attack while Ulquiorra's defense was shifted to Minato's left hand. When he had Ulquiorra on the defensive, he waved a finger, causing another bolt to spring to life from his Bankai cloud behind him. Ulquiorra thrust forth a fingertip, firing a Zero Oscuras out, which reflected the bolt of lightning in Minato's direction. With a quick Shuinpa, he appeared at Ulquiorra's side. The Segunda's wing had been completely regenerated, though there was a sizable pool of blood near Ulquiorra's feet. Ulquiorra raised his hand, trying to keep an eye on the lightning-fast Shinigami who was now flashing all around him. Ulquiorra conjured a Lanza del Relampago, twirling it around on its axis as he used it to block the ducking strike from Minato's sword. He took one hand off of it, putting one of his black Ryatsu-laden hands forward. Cascada Oscura. Minato's eyes widened as Ulquiorra's hand entered his field of vision, the blips of black Ryatsu seemingly dripping off of his fingertips. He braced for a new attack, but Ulquiorra surprised him when he halted his hand, and swung his Lanza with a horizontal strike from the right. Minato pivoted out of instinct, raising his sword up to his left temple to just barely block the strike. He locked eyes with Ulquiorra, who remained stoic, and the Shinigami came to a realization. Damn it! Lanza del Relampago. Minato's mind flashed images of what had happened beforehand, to the attack that had killed Kurosaki Ichigo. He could set off that attack on a very large scale, but would surely destroy himself in the crossfire. Or, he could scale it down to a much more concentrated form, which if hit directly would no doubt kill him. There was a flash of green light, and Minato immediately withdrew his sword and moved away. Ulquiorra detonated the Lanza del Relámpago in its concentrated form. The flash of green covered barely more than a few feet, but the hole it made clean through the bridge more than indicated what type of force it had. Minato winced as pain shot through his left shoulder. The Lanza had not even touched him, but the wind generated from the concentrated power had sliced into his shoulder, leaving his captain's Hiyori and Shinigami robes a tattered mess on that side, while blood ran down his arm in rivulets. Ulquiorra took the offensive, thrusting his hands forward. No, he's not done yet. The black Ryatsu fell off his fingertips, expanding into something far larger as it rushed toward the ground like a waterfall. Ulquiorra had used his Cascada Oscura while Minato was still recovered, and dozens of flecks of black Ryatsu fell on him. They gashed into his skin like needles, cutting straight through his robes. There was something about that attack that didn't make sense. The black Ryatsu on Ulquiorra's fingertips didn't look threatening, but he had managed to attack him with a wave of Ryuryoku, and when it hit, the attack caused much deeper wounds that one would get the impression of. Minato stared at his hand, seeing the 4 deep cuts that ran from his wrist to his bicep. The black mass covered him, and Minato fell to his knees. The Segunda Espada loomed over him, his bat-like face with the long horns making him look like a demon. Without saying a word, he conjured up another Lanza del Relámpago in the middle of his hand. Minato wouldn't have the opportunity to dodge it this time. He wound up in a thrust, preparing to jab the Lanza into his sternum. He was stabbed through the stomach no more than a second later. About time, Kushina. Ulquiorra recoiled, feeling the burning sensation in his abdomen. He grit his teeth, putting a hand around the sword and pulling it out of his body, dissipating the Lanza and clumsily bounding away. Yomi! Ulquiorra turned around, and laid eyes upon the very last thing that he would have expected. He wasn't stupid, his pesquisa would have allowed him to detect Kushina's Ryatsu, and if she had moved. However, the woman was rising out of the pool of blood that he himself had created on the ground, wrapped in her bloody cloak. It had been the perfect blind spot for her, and her Ryatsu had been virtually undetectable as she rose out of the ground. Kushina had seemingly calmed down a lot, looking at Ulquiorra with a blank expression on her face. She had pierced through a number of internal organs, but it wouldn't have been possible if her husband hadn't grounded the Segunda in the first place. When did? Ulquiorra trailed off, thoroughly perplexed on where Kushina had come from. He looked forward at Minato, whose face was an image of calmness. One of Kushina's abilities, while in Bankai, is to use blood to her advantage. As long as she has Ryatsu, she can emerge from any large enough puddle of blood that is outside the body. The reason I clipped your wing was to force you to the ground before you could regenerate, and leave behind a puddle of blood suitable for Kushina to work with, Minato explained. I see. Minato and Kushina flinched when Ulquiorra materialized another Lanza del Relámpago in his hands. I want you to fight for me, and if it comes down to it, die for me. Naruto's words rang true in Ulquiorra's head, and he blinked at Minato. He was going to lose at this rate. He had been damaged in multiple internal organs, and he could tell his movements were getting more sluggish. Stop him, Kushina. He's going to detonate that thing point blank. I'm on it, Minato. Kushina replied, rushing toward Ulquiorra, her Bankai cloak flinging droplets of blood everywhere. Ulquiorra had raised his lance, and Minato decided that he should intervene as well. Arai! Quick as a flash, a blue lightning bolt charged with Ryatsu soared out from Minato's Bankai. It was faster than the yellow lightning he was using before, and he had charged it with all of his Ryatsu. Ulquiorra turned to look at it gravely, a sense of resignation in his green eyes. His muscles were clenched around the Lanza and he was a mere millisecond away from throwing it at his feet, but he was impaled through the chest by the enormous blue lightning bolt. The Segunda Espada looked down. The bolt had taken half his body, and a hole nearly a foot in diameter had been torn through his chest. With a pained struggle, he turned his head to the side, watching Kushina swing her blood sword to knock the Lanza del Relámpago out of his hands and down into the battlefield below, where it detonated in the green display that they had seen earlier. He saw one of his horns get severed, watching as the chunk of bone fell to the ground by his feet, before watching the waterfall of blood leak out of the hole in his chest and drench the remainder of his torso. "I lost," he said simply. No emotion, no philosophical waxing. Just a statement of fact. A picture flashed through Ulquiorra's mind's eye, back to the time when he was an Ajuchus. Failure. I died for him, but I didn't even manage to kill his adversaries. How regrettable, and yet I don't feel anything. Other than normal, that is. Ulquiorra thought, before he pointed a bony finger at the palace, already turning to dust. Go. Naruto will be waiting for you. I have failed, but Naruto's ambition is still alive. When you reach him, you will see just how deeply his hatred of you runs, Ulquiorra warned, while Minato and Kushina stared in stony silence, their bankais already fading. Ulquiorra's arm fell limp to his side, as his body turned to dust. Pretty soon, he was down to nothing more than a disintegrating torso who couldn't regenerate due to the damage to his internal organs. At that moment, Ulquiorra's cipher, Segunda Espada and right hand to Naruto Uzumaki, died. Minato! Kushina muttered. Look! She pointed over the edge, and Minato knew she was referring to the rapidly thinning Hollow Army. They would not last much longer at this rate, but Minato noticed that most of the royal guard had already been killed. Akane and Taiki were still fighting on the roof. While the area where Ulquiorra died radiated a deep calmness for the first few moments, there came a deep rumbling to snap that calmness. Minato, the sky, Kushina said, her eyes wide as she stared at the source of the rumbling. Her husband looked up, scarcely believing what he was seeing. The portal above their heads was getting clearer, and Minato could feel the air around him get tighter. The image in the clear portal above them had changed. It no longer reflected Karakura town in the human world, but rather a grassy field somewhere else within the human world. Apparently, the merging of worlds was doing something. Minato, do you sense that? Something wrong is happening to this place. I can feel the air around me getting tighter, and I think I can feel Taiki's bankai at the top of the palace. Minato nodded to his wife, before the two of them took off toward the greater palace. Asshole! Akane dragged herself to her feet, coughing up blood in small spurts as she did so. Taiki had flopped over next to the soul stream, and was unmoving, though she could hear him grunting in pain. His bankai was still active too, but without its master, it just hung there uselessly. Naruto was standing before him, his monstrous resurrection active as his hollow-like body stalked over to her brother. He flexed his claws, apparently trying to get Taiki up by force if necessary. Bankai! Akane growled. Shinku Gafu, Gaijutsuka no Maisaku. Akane's shurikai glowed with a dim red ryatsu that covered the crystalline structure down to its hilt. The shurikai then exploded into a burst of ryatsu, drawing Naruto's attention to her. Bankai, he giggled. A bankai like that was truly ridiculous to him. Naruto looked at his sister, viewing how her shurikai had shattered into a million pieces. However, he was slightly taken aback when a large, red crystalline mirror appeared right in front of her, blocking her face from view. Two other identical mirrors appeared behind her, flanking her backside as they floated in midair. Using her ryatsu, she rotated the first one out of her field of vision, letting it rest to the left of her. Luckily for her, Naruto had spaced out for a moment. Whereas before he had been focused on her bankai, his blood-red eyes were now looking off to the side, as he was seemingly distracted by something. Give me a sword that can cut this Arankar. Akane muttered, seemingly to her own bankai. Her eyes were focused on the crystal to the left of her, where a long, curved blade materialized in the mirror's reflection. She reached out, slipping her hand into the crystal like it was a liquid, and grabbed the blue hilt of the long sword. Holding it down, it glowed with a fierce ryatsu. Ulquiorra! Damn it! Naruto cursed, apparently noticing that Ulquiorra's ryatsu had now disappeared. He was promptly speed blitzed by Akane, who hefted her sword over her shoulder as she swung it down at Naruto. Whoa there, bitch! Naruto called out laughing, leaping backward as he thrust his arm out to block. The sword only clipped his wrist and created a small gash, but to Naruto it seemed like his hand had almost been cut off. Naruto was still faster than Akane, and as he flashed away from contact with the sword, he regarded his wounded wrist with a sense of annoyance, flexing his claws before appearing behind Akane. He jabbed a Ryatsu-coated palm forward, and Akane tried to block it with her rear mirrors. However, she was pierced through the shoulder by Naruto's palm thrust, and whenever she flashed away, she found that the faster Naruto was right on her tail the whole time. Grimacing, she thrust her hand out to the back left mirror, touching the smooth crystalline substance. "Give me the speed to catch up with him," she ordered the mirror, to which it shined, and she was surrounded by a heavy red Ryatsu. With her boon granted, she disappeared in a flash of quick Shuinpa, much faster than she had been capable of before. Naruto had already wound up another claw thrust, but it soared into the ground like it a bullet, making a clean hole where it had punctured. He was puzzled for just a moment, before Akane appeared behind him, her special sword prepared to cut him down. He thought about thrusting his tails out, before dismissing the idea. His tails were far too important for such a thing, so he simply avoided the strikes, his pincer-like tails bobbing up and down as 6 quick strikes failed to hit him. Akane tired herself out shortly after that, taking the necessary time to recover after a series of consecutive attacks. Naruto prowled forward, his shoulder spikes jutting outward as he skidded across the ground, creating sparks as he did so. His shoulder spikes gleamed in the light, and the wind picked up as they seemed to pierce the air, coated with Ryatsu that they were. With a devious smile, he charged Ryatsu into his tails. Los Nueve Caves. Naruto's tails stood at end, glowing with the crescent-shaped Ryatsu attack that Naruto used often. It was more powerful than it was when he was a hollow, and he fired all 9 of the blasts off at once from the edge of his tails, trying to nail Akane while she flitted about with her Shuinpa. 7 of them missed their target, while the remaining 2 were deflected by Akane's crystal mirrors. When she rushed to attack him close range, the Arrancar disappeared, this time matching her Shuinpa with his own Sonido. "Give me the power to deflect any ranged attacks," she whispered to the final mirror, so low that Naruto couldn't hear her. The Primera pointed a finger at her, an orange blip of light materializing on the end of it. It whirred and hissed in the air, being much stronger than Naruto's normal Zero. He launched it, the attack range of it being nearly double than his normal Zero. The wave that could scarcely be called a Zero even drifted over to where Taiki's Bankai lay, nearly lapping at its base. However, Akane and her Bankai would take the brunt of the damage if the Zero hit. Yet, Akane thrust her hand out with enough confidence to shake a country. From Naruto's angle, it looked like she was about to catch Zero, something that Naruto laughed uproariously at. When that's exactly what happened, Naruto halted in his tracks, a deadpan look falling over his face. "What the hell?" Naruto screamed, his face twisting into rage and confusion. The orange Ryatsu from his Zero was being gathered in Akane's hands, where she held it like a baseball. "So, this is a Zero. I must say, I've never had the experience of being able to fire one myself. It seems pretty unrefined, though," she commented, swinging her hand back. She thrust it back out, firing Naruto's own Zero back at him with all the power conserved. It rocketed toward Naruto in the same wave-like pattern it had been fired. "Damn it!" Naruto cursed, looking somewhat annoyed, yet the tone in his voice suggested that he didn't even remotely feel in danger. His look down at the vortex of energy where his seal used to be. His shoulder spikes gleamed with energy. The reflected Zero approached him, and he did not move, he did not flash away, and he did no flinch. Instead, the Ryoryoku from the Zero impacted the very tip of his shoulder spikes, and began to disappear. Like lightning channeling into a lightning rod, the Zero got smaller and smaller as Naruto's shoulder spikes absorbed the energy as if they were large conductors. Akane watched in awe as the Zero had dissipated completely, leaving Naruto standing there completely unharmed. His face was split into a manic smile, and his eyes were alight with lunacy. He twitched slightly, chuckling to himself as his head bobbed up and down. His shoulder spikes stopped glowing with Ryatsu, but the seal on his chest seemed to be glowing just a little bit brighter than it was before. He reared back his head and laughed. "Nice try, dear sister of mine. It's gonna take more than a reflected zero to hurt me." Akane seemed to retreat back under the protection of her mirrors, holding the blue sword she had received a lot. "What did you do?" "Creation." Naruto trailed off, pointing one finger to his shoulder spikes and another to the vortex on his stomach. "Do you know what my special ability is?" Without waiting for her to respond, Naruto continued. "While in my sealed state, my primary ability is the control of Ryuryoku. For instance, if Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni decided to create a flame shield for himself, I could manipulate the Ryuryoku around it and effectively bypass the shield. In my resurrection." He paused, fiddling with his shoulder spikes. "My special ability is Ryuryoku absorption, which I named creation. Meaning a Ryuryoku-based attack like a zero is fair game. These are not spikes on my shoulders, they are conductors. Any Ryuryoku-based attack that makes contact with my body is channeled through those spikes." He pointed two fingers out at Akane with his thumbs sticking up, like he was going to fire an imaginary pistol at her. Pistola de bala. Suddenly, hundreds of small orbs of light were fired from the tip of Naruto's finger, like a bala rayo on rapid fire. Akane's eyes widened at the sheer barrage of bala, and she flashed away with a quick shuinpa, her crystal bankai following with her. However, Naruto had guided the stream of bullets, curving his aim over to where she would appear next. Two bullets smacked into the frontmost mirror hovering around, creating two small holes. Another grazed her right cheek, which she tilted to the side to just barely avoid. The barrage of light was taking up her entire field of vision, to the point that she missed the figure appearing directly above her head. "You're open!" Naruto roared, laughing uproariously as he came down on her and delivered a brutal kick straight to her head, knocking her out of the sky and into the roof below. Akane spun through the air, and surprisingly, her bankai followed. However, it only made things worse when she fell into a crater and impacted the crystal. Naruto roared in self-satisfaction, dive-bombing the girl as she got to her feet and prepared to retaliate. However, Naruto pulled back and dodged on instinct when a line of yellow energy barreled toward him, missing him before falling off the edge. "About time," Akane thought, seeing the two rapidly approaching figures climb up from the makeshift staircase on the roof that they had used to get here before. "Mom? Dad?" Taiki said, shuddering as he got to his feet. He had been more seriously injured than his sister, and even though he was pretty bleary climbing to his feet. "It's alright, Taiki, Akane. We're here to put an end to this," Kushina said. She locked eyes with Naruto, who had just touched the ground once again. No longer were they filled with rage, but now a forlorn sadness, and she regarded the hollow that was once her son. Minato too looked uncomfortable viewing his son in his released state, and he couldn't meet the Arrancar's steely gaze. However, Minato and Kushina were not expecting to hear the raucous laughter that emanated from Naruto's mouth. "So, you're finally here. Just in time to see Soul Society collapse. It's beautiful." Naruto roared, his laugh being carried in the wind over to the forlorn family. The portal to the real world was not far above their heads now, but the air was becoming much tighter. The grassy field and the sky hung over them still, but Minato and Kushina still didn't realize what was going on. "Akane, what is going on? What does he mean by Soul Society collapsing?" Minato asked, still not looking at his son. "I'll explain later. For now, we just need to stop him," their daughter replied. Naruto had finally calmed down somewhat, and he panned his eyes over from his parents, to Akane who was still laying in the dirt, over to Taiki who had gotten to his feet. 4-on-1. Guess it'll have to do. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed this what if and want to see next part of it, comment down below and let me know. Also share this video with your friends. See you in the next video. Peace.